The founder daughter stood in the glassboard room on her very first day as CEO, wearing a tailored designer suit that cost more than my first car. She looked down her nose at me and shouted for everyone to hand over all company property because security would escort me out immediately. She thought she was establishing absolute dominance over an old legacy employee on her first morning in power. I did not raise my voice or argue or shed a single tear. I slowly reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a heavy polished brass keyring containing the campus keys, and slid them across the sleek mahogany table. The arrogant young CEO smirked, thinking she had won, until the corporate lawyer sitting right beside her glanced down at the custom engraving on those keys. His face went instantly ghost white. His hands began to tremble, and he leaned over to whisper in her ear that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. He told her that firing me meant handing over full operational control of the entire corporate campus, because she had just triggered the one clause her late father designed to protect the true foundation of his empire. For over 30 years, I worked shoulder to shoulder with Arthur Vance, the legendary founder of Vance Global Enterprises. When Arthur started this company in a leaky basement, I was the one keeping the books, organizing the logistics, and securing the land deeds for our first major manufacturing plant. Arthur was the vision, but I was the foundation that kept the roof from collapsing. Over 3 decades, our tiny operation grew into a multi-billion-dollar empire spanning 3 major corporate campuses, housing thousands of high-tech employees. Arthur always called me the heart of Vance Global, and when his health began to decline 2 years ago, he made sure that every legal safeguard was placed in my hands. He knew his daughter Victoria was growing up spoiled, narcissistic, and obsessed with prestige rather than hard work. Victoria spent her entire adult life in Europe, throwing lavish parties on yacht decks and demanding endless allowances while completely ignoring the actual business that paid for her luxury lifestyle. When Arthur passed away 6 months ago, the board of directors reluctantly honored his final will by appointing Victoria as the brand ambassador and preliminary CEO. However, Arthur was far wiser than his arrogant daughter ever gave him credit for. He knew that the moment Victoria took the throne, she would attempt to purge the loyal old guard, to surround herself with spineless yes-men who would never question her reckless spending. True to form, on her official first morning as executive chief, Victoria called an emergency board meeting in the top-floor penthouse suite. She did not even offer a seat to the senior staff members who spent 30 years building the company. Instead, she stood at the head of the long table, folded her arms, and began her reign with pure venom. She pointed her manicured finger directly at me and declared that the company was modernizing and had no use for outdated relics from the past. She barked orders to hand over all company property, security badges, access passcodes, and office keys immediately, announcing that armed security guards were already waiting in the lobby to escort me out of the building. The entire boardroom fell dead silent as senior executives looked down in sheer shame and horror. Victoria had a triumphant smirk on her face, completely convinced she had humbled me in front of the entire corporate board. I did not flinch, nor did I show a single ounce of anger. I calmly unbuttoned my jacket, reached into my breast pocket, and pulled out a heavy ring of brass and silver keys that opened every master server grid facility gate and utility vault across all 3 massive campuses. I slid the heavy key set across the polished mahogany table right into the center of her workspace. Victoria chuckled arrogantly, picked up the keys, and tossed them into her leather briefcase, thinking her victory was absolute. But sitting right next to her was Harrison, the chief legal counsel who had served Arthur Vance for over 25 years. Harrison reached over, picked up the keys, and carefully read the serial numbers stamped into the brass base. The moment Harrison recognized those keys, his face drained of all color, and his eyes widened in absolute horror. He grabbed the legal binder in front of him, frantically flipping through the master property deeds until he reached the real estate trust annex. Harrison leaned over to Victoria and frantically whispered into her ear, begging her to stop the meeting immediately. He told her that she had just committed corporate suicide because those were not standard corporate keys. What Victoria failed to realize during her years of partying abroad was that the physical land beneath the corporate campuses did not belong to Vance Global Enterprises. Decades ago, when the company faced bankruptcy, Arthur personally transferred the ownership of the physical real estate structures and power grids into a private family land trust managed exclusively by me as the sole trustee. Vance Global merely leased the ground from my private trust on a conditional agreement. Harrison pointed a trembling finger at the legal contract and explained to Victoria that under Section 9 of the Master Land Trust, the lease agreement remained valid only as long as I held an executive leadership position within the corporation. The moment I was terminated or forced out without board unanimity, the lease instantly terminated, and full legal possession of the physical land, buildings, and power infrastructure reverted back to my personal control. By handing her those campus keys under forced termination, I was officially surrendering the corporate lease and taking back physical ownership of every square foot of the headquarters. Victoria gasped in complete disbelief, screaming at Harrison that he must be lying and that she owned everything her father left behind. But Harrison shook his head in sheer panic, informing her that without my lease's approval, Vance Global was officially trespassing on private land, and every server facility, laboratory, and office building would be legally locked down within 30 minutes. I picked up my briefcase, adjusted my coat, and looked Victoria dead in the eye as the realization finally hit her face. The security guard she had summoned to throw me out suddenly received an urgent legal directive from Harrison, telling them to stand down immediately. I walked toward the boardroom doors and turned back to inform Victoria that she had until 5 o'clock that afternoon to vacate my private property, or I would personally have the marshals padlock the entire corporate campus. Within 48 hours, the stock price of Vance Global plummeted as news of the real estate lockout reached the public market. Victoria was stripped of her executive authority by the panic-stricken board of directors, who begged me to return as chairman of the board to restore stability. I agreed only under the condition that Victoria was permanently removed from the corporate structure and placed on a strict controlled allowance, as her father originally intended.